Hello and welcome to this webinar all about anxiety. My name is Dr. Alison DeMario. I'm an educational and child psychologist working for the Xavier Catholic Education Trust. This webinar is for parents, for carers and for school staff to help you to understand anxiety a little bit better and what to do about it. And I think it's particularly timely at the moment because this year we know that research tells us that there's been a huge increase in anxiety in our children but also in adults as well. And so being able to cope with the manage anxiety for our children and manage anxiety for ourselves has never been more important. So during this session, we're going to cover what is anxiety. We're going to look at a little bit about anxiety in the brain because it's really important to understand the anxiety in the context of the child and adolescent brain. We're then going to talk about anxiety and COVID-19 and what that has meant for anxiety. We're going to look at some statistics and we're going to also look at the reasons that the anxiety might have increased. And finally, we're going to look at strategies to support children and young people, but they're also the same kind of strategies that you would use to support yourself with anxiety. And it's so important to make sure that we look after ourselves and keep ourselves regulated so that we can then regulate our children. So the first thing to explore really is what is anxiety? And the first thing I want to say is that it's a completely normal emotion. It's normal, it's natural, and it's also very useful. It's something that often we feel very afraid of when it happens, but actually anxiety is there to keep us safe, and we need it. It's allowed us to survive and to get to where we are now. So sometimes anxiety is also known as the fight or flight response, and it's called that because it's when our body goes into an emergency reaction when it perceives that there is a danger to us. So this diagram shows you all the things that happen. So it's the nervous system responds and the adrenal glands release adrenaline, and we also release glucose from our liver that gives us more energy. So there are lots of things that you'll feel happening in your body at that point, and they all have a very good evolutionary reason. So our pupils dilate to allow us to see more because we're in danger and we need to see what's going on around us. Our heart will start to beat faster so that we can get blood and energy to our extremities so that we can run faster or fight, so the fight or flight response. Our muscles become more tense because the glucose has gone to our muscles and to allow us to be stronger, but it means that trembling can sometimes occur. And we might have lots of digestive complaints as well. So our digestive system isn't needed at that point. Our body's in survival mode. So you might find that your mouth goes dry because that survivor flow has decreased. You might find that you either feel a bit sick or you have butterflies. And again, that's because the blood flow and all of our energy's kind of gone away from our digestive system to allow us to fight or flight. That is an incredibly useful response when we're faced with a real danger, like some wild animal jumping out of it, as in the middle of a park. However, if we are in a situation where we've got an exam, or we've got a bill that's come through our door, or we're in the middle of a pandemic, there isn't anything that we can fight or flight from, and therefore that anxious feeling isn't so useful and isn't so easy to get rid of. And what I often find is that actually just in telling children about that fight or flight response and understanding what it is that's happening in their bodies can be an intervention in itself, because that feeling can feel really frightening. And so once they know what it is, they feel that they've got more control over it and it immediately feels less anxiety provoking, and so stops that kind of vicious cycle. So if we go on now to talk about the signs of anxiety, with children, often they're not able in the same way as adults are to actually tell you that they're feeling anxious. We have that word. We know the word anxiety. We know all of the other words that we can use around that, like worry, nervous, anxious. All of those are part of our vocabulary, whereas it may not be for children. And also, we've probably had that feeling before, so we can put that label on it and we know what that is. Sometimes actually it's quite hard to know what that is because the feeling of anxiety is so physical sometimes. Even for us as adults, it might be difficult to know when we feel unwell, and when we feel anxious, and the difference between those two things. But for children, it's incredibly difficult because they may never have felt this feeling before. They don't have a label for it, and all they know is that they feel horrible and they feel scared. And so often, what we'll see is signs of anxiety through their behaviour rather than through what they're telling us. So one thing that you'll often see with anxiety is avoidance behaviour. And this happens because it's a horrible feeling that we've got, and so we're driven to try and avoid whatever it is that makes us feel anxious. So you might have children that are avoiding going to school, for example, and that would be often is because of anxiety at the heart of it. The second thing you might get is them complaining about the physical feelings that they're having. So it might be headaches, they might be saying that they're feeling unwell or stomach aches. You might notice that they're quite restless, they might be having difficulty sleeping, which can be to do with anxiety. They might have difficulty concentrating and just be flitting from one thing to another and getting frustrated. You might see changes in their eating habits, sometimes eating too much or sometimes not eating enough. There might be unexplained outbursts and they might just seem quite irritable. And it can be difficult to know exactly when somebody is feeling anxious if they can't tell you, because all of these symptoms can mean other things as well. But it's just important to have anxiety in your mind as a possibility. The other thing to be mindful of is that sometimes anxiety gets shown as anger rather than anxiety. So you might have a child who seems very angry all the time, and that's because anger is quite an active emotion. It's a lot easier than anxiety. Anxiety and sadness can make us feel vulnerable, whereas showing anger, it's quite active, and it makes us feel more powerful and more in control. And often what we call with anger, it's kind of like an iceberg where what you see above the surface is anger, and then there are so many other emotions that are below the surface. So it's what we call kind of a secondary emotion. And often when you look below the surface, that child is feeling worried or feeling anxious or stressed or depressed or insecure or scared or rejected or embarrassed. And what they show you is anger. So if you do have an angry child or an angry child in your class, just try and look below the surface and have a look at what other emotions there might be there as well. This table shows a list of the kind of normal fears that we would expect for children developmentally at different ages. So as you can see, the ones at the beginning of our lives, loud noises, loss of physical support, rapidly approaching objects, they're things for which that fight or flight response is really, really useful because it's our survival instinct. It's helping us to survive and it's allowing us to have the best defence against some real threats to life. However, as we get older, and especially in that adolescent phase at secondary school, the kind of things that we become more anxious about then, the kind of things that lead to that anxious feeling are things like performance in school, loss of peer relationships, appearance, and those things, the fight or flight response is much less useful, and therefore that anxiety it tends to be less situational and more long term, and less easily resolved through fight or flight. Often mental health and mental illness is something that we associate with adulthood or adolescence, but actually what this grid shows you is that anxiety disorders tend to be established earlier on in life, and actually what the statistics show us is that 50% of mental health issues are already established by the age of 14. And then we also know that 75% of all mental health issues are established by the age of 25. So it is something that we really need to act early to support children with knowing how to cope with those feelings and manage them adequately so that hopefully they don't go on to become a problem in adulthood. As I said at the beginning, it's really important to think about anxiety in the context of the growing brain. So when we think about the brain, there are very simply kind of three sections to think about. Those bottom two sections where we have the basic reflexes and the emotions, that part of the brain is fully developed from birth. However, that top area, the cerebral cortex, that takes until around the kind of mid-20s before that's fully developed and the links between those sections are fully developed. And that top section is where our thinking, reasoning, logic, planning, impulse control, empathy, that's where all of that goes on. So often young children are absolutely driven by their emotions. And if you have toddlers, or if you've come into contact with a toddler recently, you'll see that they're quite emotional and they're very unreasonable. And it's not their fault, it's just that their cerebral cortex and the links between those areas of the brain aren't fully developed yet. And as they get older, they do start to do that. So as you'll find kind of 4, 5, 6 year olds start to become more and more able to reason and able to control their impulses and to be a little bit more logical and empathise with others as they develop through childhood. So, what all of this means is that children and adolescents are much more driven by their emotions and less able to reason, which means that they're more prone to feeling anxious. And especially as for young people, it might be the first time that they felt anxious. They don't have those coping mechanisms, they're less able to reason. So, that is why you might find that in one situation where perhaps the pandemic, for example, where you've been able to kind of reason and be logical about it, you might find that children have been a lot more anxious. And this could be one of the reasons why. Another thing to mention when we think about anxiety in the brain is again going back to that fight or flight response. So often people know about what happens in the body in fight or flight, but often people don't know so much about what happens in the brain during that reaction. And what happens because the brain wants us to be able to react really quickly to whatever that threat is. What happens is that top part of the brain, the cerebral cortex, the activation in that part of the brain is reduced, which means that rather than standing there when faced with a danger and thinking about all of the different options that you might have and thinking about the pros and cons for each one, we just react straight away. And that can be really useful in a survival situation. However, when we're anxious about exams, for example, or friendships, if that top part of our brains, the reasoning, the logic, the impulse control, if that part isn't working so well, it means that we are really, really led by our emotions. And we need to have strategies to be able to try to calm down that fight or flight response so that we can start to think more reasonably. And I'm sure all of us have had that experience where we felt anxious and you just can't reason with yourself or be rational in that situation. It's only when you've calmed down a little bit that you can think more rationally. If we move on slightly to talk about the adolescent brain, although they're further on in their brain development than, say, a toddler or a child at primary school, their brains are going through a huge change called neural pruning, where they specialise in certain things that they need their brains for more, and then other connections are lost or changed. So their brains are going through a huge amount of development, and that means that they're less able to control those emotions and use that rational and reasonable thinking. Another difference with an adolescent brain is that there tend to be more dopamine receptors in the adolescent brain. And dopamine is a neurochemical that's associated with risk taking and impulsive behaviour and seeking rewards. And so that means that teenagers are wired to take more risks, but also dopamine is implicated in lots of mental health issues. And where they have more dopamine receptors, it means that they're more vulnerable at that time. Thirdly, within the teenage brain, there's a drive to be independent from their parents, which is a good thing and it's a natural thing, but it does mean that teenagers are more likely to turn to their friends to talk to them about their mental health rather than turning to their parents. And that can be a problem because the teenagers' brains are all in this state of flux, so they're not necessarily in the best place to be able to help each other in a rational way. And finally, when you add hormones into the mix, as well as all of the demands that they have facing them during adolescence, it's no wonder that they may be quite prone to anxiety. So now on to the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic. So Barry Carpenter, who's a professor of mental health in education from Oxford Brookes, said earlier this year, those 5 losses of routine, structure, friendship, opportunity and freedom can trigger the emergence emotionally of anxiety, trauma and bereavement in any child. And that doesn't mean that all children will feel anxious about the pandemic, but it definitely means that some children have lost some of those protective factors that have helped them to respond with resilience, and therefore that leaves them more vulnerable. And what is it about the pandemic that's been so stressful? I think this is a very individual question for different people, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, but these are just some of the things that may be quite common things that children encounter. So the first thing, there's been so much change. For lots of children where they were out of school for a while and then they were back in school but in small groups and then they were off for the summer and then they've been back into school where they've been full classes and now things might be a little bit different again. There's lots of change to get their heads around, aside from any other changes that they might be experiencing in their lives. And change is a stressor, it's stressful for all of us. The second thing is that comfort zones may have reduced when we've been at home and we've been quite in control of our surroundings. And then going back into school, that can feel quite stressful, especially for those children on the autistic spectrum, for example, where they've had an opportunity at home to reduce those social demands, to be away from lots and lots of social interactions and be away from the loud noises and all of the sensory stimulation that comes with the school environment. So comfort zones may have reduced and our kind of window of tolerance might be smaller. There may have been a change in sleeping patterns that make it more difficult to adapt. There may have been a reduction in the face-to-face social interactions, which now make those more difficult now because there may be losses in those relationships with the staff and peers. And there may be some peers that were able to interact more, perhaps through technology, who have become closer, and then children who didn't have access to such technology maybe feel a little bit more isolated. There's probably fear of getting ill or spreading illness to those at home, particularly if there are vulnerable people or shielding people that they come into contact with in the home environment. The emotional contagion, so just the fact that other people around them might be stressed and anxious about the pandemic, hearing it on the news all the time, having all of the updates on death rates and things, there's a lot of emotional contagion going on. The pressure to catch up has been talked about quite a lot in the media, and in some school environments there may be that pressure on children to feel that they've got to catch up and catch up on all that work missed. And there's definitely huge inequalities that have come about since the pandemic, where children from some households where they've had a lot of support and they've had the opportunities to be able to continue learning, and then in other households they haven't had the same, and so there is more inequality now following the pandemic. And finally, a reduction in the mental health support that would have been there before for pre-existing conditions. So just to share with you some of the research that came out of the pandemic about how children had coped. There was this study called the Cospace study that was based at Oxford University, and they asked parents about how their children and adolescents had been coping. And what they found throughout lockdown, through doing a number of questionnaires throughout that period, they found that for primary age children, generally, the trends were that there was an increase in behavioural, emotional and attentional problems throughout lockdown. Whereas at secondary school, there was an increase in attentional problems, so they were struggling much more with the concentration and focus on their schoolwork, but they noticed an improvement in their emotional symptoms, so they were perhaps less anxious and their mood had improved. However, what that means, whilst that's really positive, it means that perhaps having that relief from all of the academic pressure and the time pressures and the pace of work that they have within the school environment was good for them. So now going back into the school environment, that might have led to increased stress of getting back into that flow. And again, as I said before, there's been quite a lot of inequality, so the negative impact was greater for children from families with a low income. Before we go on to how to cope with anxiety and how to help our children to manage, I just want to share this with you. So, change, as I said before, it's really stressful, and there have been so many changes over the last few months. But this model from Dr. Bruce Perry, who's a neuropsychologist, he came up with this idea that actually when we have that change, there are two kind of different patterns of stress. One of them is if we see that change as very unpredictable and the stress is very extreme and it's prolonged, we're much more likely to be sensitized to that and vulnerable to anxiety. However, if we perceive that pattern of stress as something that's the change is quite predictable, the stress around it feels quite moderate, and it feels like something within our control and we feel able to cope with it, we're much more likely to respond in a tolerant, resilient way. And that's why I wanted to share this with you really, because I think this has got implications for how we support children with their stress. Because if we can make that change, the changes or the stresses, something that's predictable for them, something that feels within their control, then they're much more likely to be able to respond in a resilient way. So on to what we can do to support our children. So the first thing is to try to talk to that child about their feelings. And that can be really difficult depending on the age and the stage of the child. So for small children, they just may not have the language to be able to really explain to you how they're feeling. And for older children, they might have the language, but they just might be less willing to open up about it. So here are some top tips for you for those initial conversations particularly. So the first thing is ask twice. So the reason that we say this is a strap line from a Change for Life campaign. And the reason that it's important is that when you ask somebody how they are or if they're okay, the default response for most people is, I'm fine, I'm okay. But actually, if you then ask again, but really, how are you? That's when you're much more likely to get a genuine, honest, and open answer, and you're opening up that conversation for them to really talk to you about how they are. The second thing is to use I statements. So rather than saying, you seem worried, you seem different at the moment, which can feel a little bit confrontational and might elicit a defensive response, it can be much more helpful to use I statements like, I've noticed that lately you seem a little bit down, because that way it's your fault if you've got it wrong, rather than something that you're sort of accusing them of. The third thing is to try wondering aloud. So again, it's just a way of being a little bit less direct in the way that you're asking somebody about how they are. And it's also helping to sort of label those emotions for the children, because particularly for younger children, they might not have that vocabulary. So by wondering aloud and saying things like, I'm just wondering if you're feeling a bit anxious about being back at school. That way you're giving them that language, and they might say, no, actually, mum, I'm fine. Or they might say, yes, that is how I feel. And you've opened up that conversation. The next one is to listen, empathise and validate. So the key things here is listening really authentically, to give them that space to be able to talk, because so often we don't really get that opportunity to have somebody just sit and listen to us, and it can be really, really powerful. And you don't have to be a psychologist or a therapist of any kind to be able to do this, because you can have those kind of therapeutic conversations by just making a space, even if just for a few minutes, to listen and to really listen and really hear somebody. So the first thing is to listen authentically and actively, empathise with that person, really show them that you understand how they're feeling, not by bringing your own emotions into it and saying about how you feel, but by saying, oh yes, I would feel like that if that happened to me as well. And validate. It's totally understandable and totally normal that you would feel that way. The next bit is probably the most important tip, so I should have put this first really, but it's key that whenever you're trying to talk to somebody about a problem or about a feeling, don't try to fix it. And I think as adults, we're really, really guilty of this sometimes because of that power imbalance between adults and children. And because of the way that we sort of nurture and care about children, if they tell us a problem, we want to fix it for them. And actually, if you think about when you've told somebody a problem that you've had before, the worst thing that somebody can do is to start to try and give you solutions and try and fix that problem for you, because it just feels like they're not understanding what you've said, they're not really listening, and they're making you feel a bit silly almost, because if the problem was that easy to solve, they would have solved it themselves. So it's really disempowering and really de-skilling when you come to somebody and try and fix their problem. And also, it puts a lot of pressure on yourself to try to fix it. And actually, the best thing that you can do is listen, empathise, validate, and then think with that child about how they might be able to move forward and what would help them. So questions like, what can I do that might help you at the minute? Or what do you think you might be able to do that would make you feel better? Because often people have the answers to their problems within them, and they just need a bit of help to be able to bounce it back off somebody and have that space to think about it and talk about it rationally. And the last one is to focus on identifying their thoughts. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment. But one of the key strategies or key interventions for anxiety is something called cognitive behavioural therapy. And the main crux of cognitive behavioural therapy is that there is this link between what you think, which impacts on how you then feel and how you then behave. So if we go to the on the right hand side there, the how you feel, if how they feel is anxious, what we've really got to get to the crux of is what their thought process is that's making them feel anxious, because often there could be some sort of irrational thinking in there that's making them feel really anxious. And if we can change that thought process, then we can really help them to move forward. So when I speak to children who are really anxious about exams, for example, a really common pattern of negative thinking are things like, my family will be disappointed in me, I'm going to fail, and by fail usually they mean not get all A's and B's, which is irrational thinking in itself. They might be thinking that their life will be overall ruined if they don't get the exam results that they want. So there's lots of kind of faulty thoughts in there. And if we can get to find out what those thoughts are through those initial conversations, then we can start to challenge them. And this is where fixing the problem isn't very helpful. But actually, if whenever you're going to give advice, you can stop yourself and just ask a question, that's one of the best things that you can do to help them. And these are some really useful questions to ask when you're trying to challenge some of those thoughts. So, I mean, it's not helpful if somebody says to us, oh, of course that's not true. Of course nobody's going to be disappointed in you. Of course that your life's not going to be ruined. Doesn't really make us feel any better. And again, it can just make them feel a little bit silly and that their problem or their worry isn't really very valid. So these are some good questions to ask. So saying to them, okay, what's the evidence for that thought? What is the evidence that your life will be ruined if you didn't get a B in your exams? What's the evidence against that thought? Based on that, what might be a more balanced thought? And these ones are crucial. So what would you say to a friend who had that worry? Because often for all of us, we're much kinder to other people than we are to ourselves, and we're much more balanced and rational in the way that we think. And what might your best friend say to you if they heard your worry? And often through asking those kind of questions, they're able to be a lot more balanced. And that's going to help because then their thought is more balanced and that's going to make their feeling much less intense. Another thing that can be useful, particularly at the moment and where we find ourselves in a lockdown situation again, is that often things that are outside of our control, like the pandemic and the lockdown restrictions and the fact that we can't do all the things that we'd want to do, and the possibility of getting a virus, there are so many things that are outside of our control that can make us feel really anxious. And so focusing on things that you can control can help to alleviate some of that anxiety. Okay, so once we've talked to children about what is exactly happening in our bodies that makes us anxious, we've taught them that it's really normal to feel anxious, and we're helping them to accept that feeling of anxiety and not be so frightened of it. We also need to teach them tools to control it when it does happen, when it inevitably does happen, and that's fine. And by having these strategies to get the nervous system back in balance once that does happen, that helps us to feel in control. And when we feel in control, we feel more resilient in difficult situations. And it's also important to know that with that fight or flight response, just as the brain can send messages to the body to tell the body that they're in a threat situation, the body can also send messages back up to the brain to tell the brain that we're not in a threatening situation. And we can do that by taking really deep, slow breaths. And so a lot of these calming strategies are around slowing that breath down to send that message back up to the brain that we need to get the nervous system back into balance and stop that fight or flight reaction. So one thing that you can use with your children is mindfulness. Mindfulness is brilliant. It's the idea that actually in the present moment, if we can just try to focus on the present, which we very rarely actually do, then that can be very calming because all of the time our worries are things that very well usually are in the past or things that are happening in the future, and very often worries start with the words what if, and we're worrying about the future. So if we can just focus on the present, then that can be very calming. And there are lots of really good mindfulness apps to help you with that. There are ones like Calm, for example, Headspace, and one called Umvana as well, which are all really good. There's also lots of books, lots of free ones on YouTube. You can also use visualization or guided meditation, and again, there are lots of those available on YouTube as well. And prayer can be brilliant, and there are lots of Christian mindfulness exercises that you can do. Hand breathing is something that children find quite useful. So you've got that diagram there just to illustrate. So it would be where you just trace your finger around your hand, and as you move up the fingers, you breathe in slowly and then breathe out as you move your finger down. And if you do that around both hands, nice and slowly, not only does it help to slow the breathing down, but it also provides a distraction. And distraction is brilliant whenever we're in an anxiety-provoking situation. So that's hand breathing. Then you've got one called square breathing, which starts with the idea that anywhere that you are, if you look around you, you'll pretty much always be able to find a square or a rectangle around you. And all you need to do is just focus on that square or rectangle. And again, this one's brilliant when you're in an exam because exam papers are always rectangular. So you just find a rectangle or a square, and then you trace it with your eyes. And as you do so, you just go up and breathe in for 4. And then as you go across the top, like that diagram on the right hand side, you hold your breath for 4. And then as you go down the other side of the square, you breathe out. And then hold again for 4. And then just repeat that over and over again until you've brought your body back into a sense of calm. Another one that you can try and do, and this one's really brilliant for if you struggle with getting to sleep, because it's kind of like the counting the sheep sort of idea. And this is something called 7-11 breathing. And this is the idea that you need to breathe in for 7 seconds and then breathe out for 11 seconds. And by extending that out breath, it really helps to calm the nervous system. And then finally, the last one is progressive muscle relaxation, which is a really handy one, again, for if you have children who struggle to get to sleep because of their anxiety. Progressive muscle relaxation can be really useful. If you search this on YouTube, there are lots of guided ones on there for you, and it's just where you basically tense the muscles progressively as you move up your body from your feet all the way up to your head, and then progressively relax them, isolating different body parts as you go down. And then by doing that, you end up feeling really nice and relaxed. So that's quite a good technique to use. As well as the good quality research-based evidence from things like CBT, the cognitive behavioural therapy, and mindfulness for reducing anxiety. There's also evidence from positive psychology about the power of things like gratitude and positive thought. And by making it a habit of thinking about things that have been positive about your day or things that you're grateful for, if you do that over a period of time, it becomes habitual, where without even having to think about it, you'll look more at the positive things and become more sort of grateful for the things around you without having to make so much effort to do that. And that can have a huge impact on your happiness and a reduction in anxiety. And there are some really nice resources out there to help you to do this. You by no means need to buy into anything to do this. Just a blank notebook would be fine for writing down the positives at the end of the day. And it's a nice thing to talk to children about as you're putting them to bed. But also there are things like this, which is the Happy Self Journal. And this is just an example of a one-page spread. This would be an intervention that you can use with children over a period of 3 months. And every day they'd have a double-page spread, all different, just to make them focus on lots of things that are really positive for well-being, such as thinking about things they're grateful for, thinking about things that have been really good, setting themselves challenges, thinking about positive things about themselves, and thinking about things that they've achieved. And if we're thinking about supporting anxiety in really young children, obviously they may not call it anxiety, and so it's useful to use the language that means something to them. But there are some really nice techniques that you can use very easily at home. So there are some brilliant books out there, one of which is called The Huge Bag of Worries, which can help to introduce that concept of worry and anxiety and open up those conversations about what makes them feel worried and how that feels within their bodies. It's quite nice to sometimes draw pictures of kind of a gingerbread outline and then ask children to sort of colour in where they feel it on their body when they feel that sense of worry. And that helps them to identify it as a worry rather than as a tummy ache or as a headache or as achy arms or achy legs. Worry monsters, which I've pictured one of those on there, they can be really useful. They're just cuddly toys with a zip for a mouth, and they're called worry monsters. And it just means that anytime they're worried about something, they can talk about it, write it down with you, and then you can make the worry monster eat it, which is just quite a nice visualization of that worry going away. But it's also just a good vehicle for opening up that conversation and getting them to talk to you about it. Thirdly, blowing worry bubbles can be a nice mindful exercise of visualizing worries and blowing bubbles and watching those bubbles float off and pop and feeling those worries melt away. And then finally, using puppets or using some of their toys and trying to project their worries onto the toys can be quite a nice indirect way of talking about worries, because children who are in the early years, they find it very difficult to put themselves in other people's shoes and empathize because of the stage of development that they're in. So by asking them, how do you think this um, puppet is feeling, then they're feeling quite anxious. What might they be anxious about? They will probably tell you the things that they are anxious about because they can only really see things from their perspective. And then you might use another puppet to play with that toy or with that puppet to be able to say, okay, what can this puppet say to this puppet that might help them to feel better? Or what could they do that might help them to feel better? And by doing that, you can really open up those conversations and help them to think about ways forward. And the last thing I want to talk about is something called the Healthy Mind Platter, which was developed by Dr. Dan Siegel, who's a child psychologist and author of lots of brilliant books, like The Whole Brain Child, for example, if that's something that you've read. And he came up with this idea of the Healthy Mind Platter, which is a play on the idea of a healthy plate. So we know what we should have on a plate of food to keep us physically healthy. But for most of us, we don't really know what we should do and what activities we should do in a day to keep ourselves mentally healthy. And these were the things that, based on research evidence, he suggested should be within our days to keep us mentally healthy. So first thing is sleep time, having enough sleep, and that obviously depends on the age of the child and adult as to how much sleep they should have. But I think for a lot of adolescents, they aren't getting the amount of sleep that they probably should be getting, which is I think is roughly 9 hours. Sleep's really important because when we don't sleep well, we can't regulate our emotions as well. So if you think about times when you've maybe not slept enough and then in the morning you felt a little bit more frustrated or angry and snap a little bit more easily, it's the same with our anxiety. We're much less able to cope with our anxiety and control our anxiety if we haven't slept enough and if we aren't able to regulate that emotion. And the second thing is exercise. So we know how important exercise is, particularly exercising outside releases even more endorphins than just normal exercise. And endorphins help us to feel happier and they also help us to feel calmer. Third thing is focus time. So within each day, we need something that helps us to feel like we're achieving something, something that's goal directed. So for most children, they have plenty of that at school where they're focusing to achieve something. The next one's connecting time. So time to spend time with our family and people face to face. It's just not the same. And I'm sure everyone's had this experience. It's just not the same through a screen as it is in person. So having time to connect in person. Playtime, so time to do something that we enjoy. And for children, obviously, that might be running around outside and playing. But for adults, it might be something like reading or doing crafts or baking or cooking or anything that you enjoy, really. Sometime that's something for you that you enjoy. And I think that can easily get lost in adult life. Next one is downtime, and this is time just to allow yourself, your mind to wander, and just not doing anything in particular. And I really like this picture here of a person lying on a sun lounger in the sun, because when we're on holiday, often if you're anything like me, we do that, don't we? We lie there doing absolutely nothing apart from just soaking up the sun, and it feels lovely. And yet, in everyday life, we afford ourselves so little time to be able to just kind of go on a walk and just let our minds wander and download some of those thoughts that we're having about the day. And then finally, time in. And this is time in to reflect on the day. So it might be reflecting on the positives, it might be doing some mindfulness, it might be reflecting on things that you're grateful for. But again, sometimes we can get so rushed with everything else that's going on in our day that we don't spend any time reflecting on it. So before we finish, I'd just like you to spend a little bit of time thinking about what that healthy mind platter would look like for your child if you divided up their day into that healthy mind platter. Would they have time for everything on there? And what would it look like for you? Do you make time for you to do all of those things that mean that you also can feel regulated and can support your own mental health? And think, what do you need to make more time for them? And what do you need more time for you? And how can you do that? As we come to the end of this session, there are some resources and support that I just want to share with you. One is the Anna Freud Centre. Their website has lots of information, both for school staff and for parents in supporting anxiety. There's also a website called MindEd for families and MindEd for schools, and that is a website that has really small kind of courses on all manner of different areas of mental health that you can watch a really short video, but it gives you more knowledge about certain areas of mental health if there's another area that you're concerned about, you want to learn more about. Kooth is a confidential advice line that children and young people can call, and also they can access online as well. There's something called the SAM app, which is Self-Help Anxiety Management app, which is a really good one. There's also another app called Mindshift CBT, which uses that thought challenging ideas and encourages them to keep thought diaries, and that can be really useful. And then finally, there's one called Me Too, which is a social platform, a social media platform, which has been designed for children but heavily regulated by adults to keep it really safe. And it's one where children can write in about things that they're worried about or things that have happened to them. And then other young people can support them by posting on there about their experiences as well. But it's really heavily regulated. So it keeps it quite a safe and productive environment. I hope you found this session useful, and please do contact me at any time if there's anything that you want to know more about. But for now, thank you very much for watching.